Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. To celebrate October being Archives Month, we are joined today by archivists Jamie Brinkman, Joshua Hauk-Wheelton, and Tom Ruller for our program, Fun Finds in the Archives. Today's presentation starts with our award-winning short film, narrated by actor Stephen Lang, that shows many facets of the work of the New York State Archives in Albany, plus the role of the Archives Partnership Trust. From there, our speakers will reveal a small sample from the nearly 400 years of government records held at the State Archives to see unique, surprising, unexpected, and just plain fun finds.
This tri-folded document hasn't seen the light of day in over 300 years. It's joined by hundreds of thousands of similar documents from New York State's history, in desperate need of preservation and stabilization. So how does this document tell us the story of the past? When we rely on memory, it is imperfect, constantly vanishing. When we rely on recollection, it is subject to interpretation, retold through ever-changing lenses. But when we rely on records, the past is present. It is real, and it is in the words of the people who were there. Records like these, preserved by the New York State Archives, remind us of our origins and tell the story of human history. They are records that, without preservation, silence the voices that weave our state's rich tapestry, that give purpose to our ways of life. Their paths are our paths. They help us remember who we are. The Archives houses and protects over 270 million documents covering nearly 400 years of New York State's history, providing an endless supply of material to shape humanities-themed projects that provide essential context for historical events and demonstrate history's relevance to today. New York State has funded the work of the Archives since its inception in 1971. The staff, the facility, and the mandate. Every citizen has the right to access these records, and the demand for historical preservation and programs and tools citizens can use to access and use these records has never been greater. The Empire State recognized this need, and in 1992 formed a unique public-private partnership to create the New York State Archives Partnership Trust, making it the only state archives in the country with a support organization established by a state legislature. With partnership as its middle name, it should come as no surprise that the Archives Partnership Trust is committed to advancing New York State history by fostering an atmosphere of collaboration. It is because of the generosity from our family of supporters that we have a proud and strong statewide network of committed community and cultural organizations, schools, and libraries, helping build programs that tell New York's stories and preserve priceless resources for all New Yorkers. Our education initiatives like ConsiderTheSourceNY.org help train educators to use primary source documents in the classroom and put them in the hands of students of all ages. Our Larry J. Hackman Research Residency Program offers teachers, graduate students, and researchers support to conduct research at the State Archives. Our award-winning New York Archives magazine, celebrating over 20 years in publication, provides primary source-based articles connecting general readers to the rich and diverse history of New York State and its people. Our New York Archives magazine speaker series highlights authors, historians, and other experts who keep the rich and diverse voices of our history alive. preservation funding secured by the Trust has helped preserve exquisite records documenting important events, such as court cases against Loyalists, urban renewal efforts across New York State, and the governing of the New Netherland colony. Finally, the Trust's signature statewide program, the Empire State Archives and History Award, recognizes the contributions of a national figure who advances the understanding and uses of history within our society. Laureates have included an illustrious list of historians, documentarians, and actors. These are just a few of the many initiatives currently underway at the Trust. Whether you are interested in Dutch documents from New Netherland, artistically drawn maps chronicling the construction of the Erie Canal, screenplays from Hollywood's golden age, or maybe you are the family genealogist or a classroom educator looking for primary sources, the State Archives has a piece of New York history for you. And through the work of the Trust, the archives will be able to continually expand access to these documents and innovative historical programs well into the future. There is no more important work than telling the stories of the past, looking backward to ensure we never forget the lessons of our shared history, and tell our stories so we can understand the impact of our voices on the future. Supporters like you make it possible for the New York State Archives Partnership Trust to preserve our history, help protect our most treasured assets, and provide all of us with countless reminders of exactly who we are. We are New York.
Great. So now that you have seen a little bit about what we do, I'm going to introduce today's speakers to you. Jamie Brinkman is an archivist with the Researcher Services team at the New York State Archives. She spends her time helping digitize thousands of pages of records and providing reference assistance to researchers near and far. Joshua Hauk-Wheelton is also part of the Researcher Services team at the New York State Archives, and he's not tending to the stacks. He and his colleagues assist researchers in hunting down the information they're searching for. Thomas J. Ruller recently retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he held since 2015. Here, Tom oversaw care and access to over 5,000 cubic feet of canal records, including thousands of maps of New York's canal system. An active professional for 35 years, he is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. And just as a bit of housekeeping, we will have a question and answer session at the end of this presentation. So for those of you who have joined us today, you can feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll set aside a few minutes at the end to get to as many of those as we can. And now I'm pleased to introduce the New York State Archives' very own Jamie Brinkman, Joshua Hauk-Wheelton, and Tom Ruller.
Thank you very much, Josie. This program is, hopefully, is inspirational to all of you who are watching it. We, as archivists, have the opportunity to interact with this enormous collection, 33 miles of records that we preserve in the state archives every day. But every day, we have the opportunity to see some incredible gem, some unknown fact that finally comes out and is brought to the fore. Today's program is, I'd like to say, is an opportunity to look at a piece of a snowflake on the tip of the iceberg of the enormous quantity of material that we preserve and, as the video said, make available for all New Yorkers, for anyone doing research. So I'm not going to belabor the scope of what we do, but I do want to remind all of you that see this. every one of these documents that you're going to look at is a doorway into thousands of others that are similarly surprising, similarly educational, and similarly revealing about New York's great story and where New York can go in the future. I'm going to get off the screen so that my colleagues, Jamie and Josh, can show you some of these great fun finds and great treasures that we preserve for all of you.
Let's start with something you probably do not expect to find within the archives. This is a book of poetry by Samuel Roth. In future decades, Samuel Roth would go on to become a publisher, a famous publisher of salacious and scandalous works. He'd be the first person in America to publish Lady Chatterley's Lover, as an example. But this is in 1917, and he's a student in Columbia, and he's getting his start writing poetry. This particular book was owned at some point by Frank Tannenbaum. Frank would go on to be a noted sociologist and criminologist, but at this point, he is also a student at Columbia and also a busboy and member of the Industrial Workers of the World, a leader of the Industrial Workers of the World, aka the Wobblies. Here you can see he dedicated it to a fellow worker, Abner Woodruff, who we know significantly less about. He was a publisher, Marxist literature for the Wobblies. This particular book had a long history. Well, okay, in years terms, only a couple years, but it had a history passing through the radical labor politics of New York during 1917 to 1919. In 1919, it was picked up by the Lusk Committee, the Joint Committee for the Investigation of Seditious Material, probably in a raid. We don't know where. And so this particular book has been preserved for all time, thanks to the paranoia of the, hey, I call it as it, of the 1919, 1920 New York. Very shortly thereafter, the Lusk Committee would be shut down. The Palmer raids were about at the same time, slightly more famous. And their overreach, their tendency to grab anybody who had a foreign accent who happened to be nearby, was their undoing. Let's see here if we can get, not really. You can get a view of some of the poetry here. Despite the fact that this was seized in a raid for seditious material, the material is very much a college student first collection of poetry. You see here, after burning the letter she returned to me, which just screams baby's first breakup. He was very young, Samuel Roth, at this point. Many of his other poems were dedicated to fellow students and friends. But now this is an extremely rare book, so I will put it down very soon. It is not findable on WorldCat. It shows up in 8 books and so forth. This is the copy that I can find that is actually in the best condition that I've been able to see, all thanks to the fact that it was captured and now stored forever in our acid-free boxes.
All right, my turn to show off some things. So what we have here are from series A4023. It's the state engineers and surveyor state drawings of state boundary markers and monuments. You can see here's a great example of one of the pages. This series consists of 3 volumes of water paint drawings. As you can see, this one is mostly done in a series of grays, which is what a majority of the series is. Now, these came about in 1900 during one of the examinations of the boundary markers and monuments that were ordered by law that the state engineer and surveyor do every 3 years. So they decided in 1900 that it was time to make some beautiful drawings of the areas. The law also directed them to replace or repair any of the damaged or missing monuments. Now, this one I have up here, this is what a typical page would look like in this series. These are all along the New Jersey line. You can see the top left one is near Port Richmond. Now, these aren't the majority, they are more of the exception, but here's a lovely example of a color water paint. This is also on the New Jersey line, and you can see that this one has two markers right here. It's kind of hard to see, but there are two in there. One is the 20-mile, I think it might be milestone 20. And then the larger one is the county stone for Rockland and Orange counties. These are really fun. They are something that my colleagues and I wouldn't have necessarily thought would be state records, but they are a beautiful set of water paints that have been recently digitized, and we're hoping to get them online for people to be able to browse.
Now, here's something that's a little more traditional for an archives, at least the government archives. These are some of the court documents that were introduced, as you saw one of our colleagues, Anne-Marie, folding, or rather unfolding at the beginning of the video. In this particular case, these are from the Court of Chancery from 1844. If you could just make up the names at the top, that's Phineas T. Barnum versus Frederick Randall. Phineas T. Barnum is exactly who you think he is. Frederick Randall was better known as the Scottish Giant, or Randall the Giant, or a couple of variations. In this particular case, it appears that Frederick Randall either had contracted or perhaps had actually performed the act of going from New York City, where Barnum's museum was, up here to Albany, where Mr. Meach had the American Museum, and where Randall either did perform or was scheduled to perform for briefly. Barnum considered this a violation of his contract that he had formed with Frederick Randall and took him to court. The case, these are simply the filings. The case picked up by the court reporter ended up being somewhat complicated, coming down to questions of, the remedies that Barnum was seeking. Did they make sense? Couldn't things be settled by the normal negotiation means through the contract? Whether the writ he was seeking that would have held Randall to New York City actually could apply, that sort of thing. In general, it seemed like the case just sort of fell apart because Barnum was trying to do something with the Court of Chancery that the Court of Chancery thought was a bit of a reach. And so it must have been settled through normal contract negotiation schemes. Although there's some hints that Randall may have spent a couple nights in prison along with his wife, who was also part of the act. But eventually it must have been settled because Randall goes on to be an established part of Barnum's act. We know relatively little about Frederick Randall. We know really nothing. Barnum seems to suck up all the air in the room, as I'm sure it surprises nobody. Most of what we know about Barnum comes from his own autobiographies, so that sort of jaundices things a bit. But this is a good example of where primary sources can help fill in a couple of small areas. For example, the oral tradition of Frederick Randall was that Barnum discovered him as a bricklayer in New York City. Such was not the case. We know from these filings and the court reports that Randall was actually a performer in Europe and England and was contracted to come over here, which is probably part of why Barnum was so esteemed that he was also going up to Albany. So we now know that Randall was an established performer of his giant trade. So this does help us fill in somebody who otherwise basically disappears into oral tradition. Let's see here. Incidentally, if you can read this, do apply for a job here at the archives. Because yeah, this is as difficult to read. Jokes about how they're not teaching kids today cursive just fall apart when you have to deal with 19th century fast writing in the court systems. So, but these are all the filings. The court records are sort of spread out through a number of different collections. We've also found a bond that Randall put forward, possibly taking Barnum back to court for his side of things. So these court records are a tremendously valuable resource for New York State. They really do show a different side of what's going on than sort of appears in the official secondary sources. So I'll pass back on to Jamie.
And if I can just add a little bit, the court records collection that we have is pretty unique and very expansive. We're talking about probably 7,000 boxes of court records, both the Court of Chancery, all the statewide courts, dating from 1690 to 1847. So there have been a number of tremendously interesting finds in those records, but they're an untapped resource. And that's, as Josh said, where some of the gaps in our memory, the gaps in our documentary record can be filled, but you have to look through a lot of material.
All right, thanks, John. So the next series I am going to show, it has some of my favorite little fun finds that I just happened to stumble upon when I was going about my work, is series B1406. It's the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Bureau of Real Property field books of Verplanck Colvin for the Adirondack Survey. And no, I did not memorize that. I did have to read that off a piece of paper. So Colvin was a prominent surveyor, and he was a promoter of the creation of the Adirondack Park. Here's one of the items. Ooh, apologies. This collection consists of over 440 volumes of field books like this one right here that were created by Colvin and his associates from 1872 to 1900. The field books are highly technical and scientific in nature. Colvin and his associates were tracking measurements and calculations, as you can see. Things like triangulation observations, solar observations. They were doing chain link measurements as well. You name it, they were doing it and marking it down. You can see there's some messy handwriting. It's not just the court documents. It is also those wandering around the Adirondacks as well. So on top of being a pretty prominent and well-known surveyor, Colvin was also an amateur artist. He would include his illustrations in annual reports on the Adirondack surveys that they were conducting. He would also have some illustrations that he would hide in his books when inspiration struck when he was out on his surveys. So this particular one that I am showing is volume 271, and it contains a handful of illustrations among those triangulation surveys and calculations of the lower Saranac Lake, Keene, and Gore Mountain areas, completed in 1877. This is a view of Hospital Point on Lake Champlain in Port Henry. You can see he's got a little view from wherever he was sitting at the time. It was in July 1877. The next page then contains an image of Barber's Point Lighthouse near Westport, New York. I believe that is still a decommissioned lighthouse that exists today. So you can see sometimes he just took the time when inspiration struck. Now, the one I'm going to show you is my favorite one that I found in the collection, just because of his use of color. As you can see with the page, they are, it is a 1884 field book that contains some observation and survey notes from the Taunton and Crossfield purchase. Now this, you did not see that. This is a page, you can see the calculations, and then up in this upper right-hand corner is a colored pencil drawing that he did of a stone that was on the boundary line for township number 24. I thought it was such a fun find when I was working on this collection, just the use of colored pencil, and he just loved the view so much that he needed to draw it. And I feel like typically you don't see a ton of colored pencils from that time period, just the fact that he was carrying them around, waiting for that inspiration to strike. And it's fun to see such a difference between the rest of the field book is so technical and scientific in nature, but there's also this interesting artistic and fun side to it as well.
Those particular books are, we talk about the DNA of people being connected to these records. Those are the field books that they carried in their backpacks or wherever when they were hiking around the Adirondacks in the 1870s. And the technical field books ultimately resulted in a lot of maps. So Colvin's mission was to map the Adirondacks. And that's how they did it. You did it with a lot of measurements and a lot of other things. And really, Colvin is the person from the government who took responsibility for helping understand what the geology and what the topography of and the possibilities of the Adirondack Mountains were. It's a great, just having those field books is a great way to connect directly to the people who broke the trail to some extent in the Adirondacks.
Moving to a little more recent material, something that may require a juggle. 1 second. Here we are. Let's see here. These are costume binders, aka costume Bibles, created by the New York State Theater Institute. The Theater Institute actually is a creation of SUNY Albany, I believe, or at least the SUNY system. Back in the mid-70s, the attempt was to create a organization for the promotion, production, invention, and so forth of children's theater and young adults theater. Not really a surprise in New York State. They would go on to be internationally renowned. We'll get to that later. This particular Bible is the costume Bible from Raggedy Ann and Andy, or Rag Dolly, or a couple of different names. As you can see here, we have concept sketches of some of the characters, various circus characters who would appear throughout the musical. This particular musical was a production of William Gibson and is probably their most famous work. You can see here a fabric swatch. Anyone else pass back? And you can see a whole lot more fabric swatches. Here we see them going through the process of the nitty-gritty of the costumes. This is for ensemble union suits for the characters. These are little bits of terry cloth stapled to the paper, and if you can just make out here, they put this through various processes of bleaching and color removing to see what would look best, what would hold up through repeated use throughout the run of the play. Union suits, you can start seeing a little more elaborate fabric here. Various characters. We have these, if for Rag Dolly, if you go back to, for example, their production of Amadeus, a lot of that comes down to period research for what would be appropriate for the time period. So the fabric's temples give way to large chunks of primary research and secondary research. Rag Dolly, as I said, was their most famous play, and it was one that was internationally renowned. During the middle 80s, during the softening of tensions between the US and the USSR, there was a sort of a talent exchange where an organization from America went to perform theater in Moscow, and a troupe from Moscow came to America to perform. And Rag Dolly was one of the productions that America performed in Moscow, where it was apparently extremely popular. Ironically, it was much less popular here in the States, where it actually apparently kind of bombed. Rag Dolly / Raggedy Ann was a cheerful musical about a young girl suffering from a heart condition and eventually to be fatal. And the darkness apparently did not play well. She goes on various adventures with her imaginary dollies, Raggedy Ann being the obvious one. So it lasted, I think, a year on Broadway, while doing quite a bit better in Russia. But if you want to hear that story, you are welcome to check out the 2020 spring issue of our magazine, where our able colleague Jasmine Bumpers wrote that up as the primary article. It's available online as the free article for that issue. So look for the cover with Raggedy Ann on it, and you'll be sure to see it.
All right, next up, we have an item from Series A 1418. That is the New York State Motion Picture Division License Application Case Files. Now, here's another perfect example of records that you wouldn't necessarily assume would be in state records. The Motion Picture Division was tasked with viewing films that were going to be seen in New York State from the 1920s to the 1960s. They were basically looking to make sure that there wasn't anything that would corrupt the population of New York State. And what their standards for being censored was a lot different than today. A lot more strict over things. Now, what I'm holding up is a dialogue script from the 1958 movie The Blob. I thought I would get a little bit of like a spooky horror movie in there for October. So as you can see, some of the files that we have from the motion picture will contain the scripts for these movies. There's the page, the title page, and as you can see, it starts having the screen directions for fading off as it plays the opening credits. Oh, as you can see, it's got it all mapped out. A typical file for the motion picture division, in addition to sometimes having a script. Now, when we're talking about the 20s, there are years in there that it was silent films, so there is no script. It is just some information about censoring, correspondence about you need to change these parts of the film, otherwise you can't show it in New York State. There's also these packages of papers where the film distributors are looking for seals to be able to show their movies in New York State. You can see that this one was approved in July of 1958 for the motion picture to receive one original seal to be able to show the movie in New York State. And you can see that there's also in this one, it happens to be a reviewer's report, and it was approved without any eliminations requested, things that they would have to change with the film so it could be approved to be shown. And it wasn't rejected in total or referred to the director. So apparently they had no issues with the Blob back in 1958. The motion picture division files are really interesting. They, as I said, it spans 40 years worth of materials. It has scripts that are in the English language, but also we have ones that are in French, Arabic, German. We have films from all over the world. They range in what they're talking about, smaller films, but there's also well-known ones like Gone with the Wind, The Blob, Shanghai Express, a number of films. So it's usually fun to take a peek at those when researchers are requesting them for their own research purposes.
And I'd just like to say we have all of those indexed. You can search through the entire 73,000 motion picture files on our website. Go for a search for records under the tab at the top and look for film scripts or film files. I can't remember exactly how we phrased it. And you can search by title, year, director, that sort of thing. We have scripts from films that are otherwise lost. Because studios were not particularly careful about preserving some of their older films. So definitely, if there's a film you're interested in, as you said, we do not have much option for going through these just on a whim. So please do ask, because in many cases it's the first time we get to look at them too. Let's see, we've got about 10 minutes. Do we want to talk about our placement here?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have here which you can just see at the bottom of your screen, the James Hall Geological Chart, a 4-foot by 3-foot geological cross-section of New York State, created 1850s, 1852, we think, by the state paleontologist and soon to be first director of the State Museum, which is probably how we have it. Oh my. And James Hall. And we will now pass to Jamie, who is climbing on the table. Okay. Okay, you're scanning here. Okay, here we see the cross-section of this. I'm sorry, I'm not a geologist. Cross-section of the layers of sediment within New York State. You can see they're nicely color-coded, allowing you to tell by which period we're dealing with. Let's see, we can go ahead and pan. Ooh. As you can see, well, actually, you probably can't, but you can see here, they have the bedrock granite all the way over to the left. We have the beginnings of the Potsdam sediment up through the quartz and the various layers up until the modern day. And now we're passing on the camera. And here you see the index fossils. These are at the time period of the 1850s. If you wanted to date a rock from, there was no carbon dating, obviously, there was no radiometric dating. So you looked for any fossils that it might contain. And the types of fossils that it would contain would be used for dating that particular layer. So providing the fossils for a particular layer was absolutely essential for establishing the chronology. So Hall went to great lengths. You can see the mastodon up at the top right. You can see the various shells and fossils, which are probably a lot more commonly found. You can also probably see that he misspelled tertiary. So this is a rough draft. We have another, which we think is a rough draft. Hopefully we also have a final copy, but it is shellacked and in need of conservation, so we haven't unrolled it.
Well, the most interesting part, at least for me, while it is a very interesting and intricate chart, is the story behind the chart. In the late 40s, James Hall, who was the first state geologist, paleontologist, and director of the museum, got a glimpse of a chart that was created by a school teacher from Greenbush, New York, called James Foster. He was outraged. He thought that Foster's chart was inaccurate. It didn't show anything about New York State. And also, quite frankly, Hall wanted to monetize on the fact that he had been the one that did this geological survey. In the next few years, there was a libel suit brought by Foster against James Hall and some of his colleagues who he said were slandering him in the newspapers over this chart. Foster also tried to correct his chart with the help of another geologist. And in 1852, he had copyrighted his chart in Albany, and it was going down on a night boat to New York City to be published. And somehow on that night boat, the chart got tossed overboard, completely destroying Foster's work. And come to find out, there was somebody else on that boat that night. That would be one James Hall. I think I am safe to say that it is pretty widely accepted that it's likely that James Hall tossed that chart over the boat on his night passage. So it effectively destroyed Foster's chart, and James Hall took the opportunity to publish his own chart, which you see here, and it had quite a bit of commercial success. For him, he got to do exactly what he wanted. He made the money off of his geological survey. And while the archives has 3 copies, which seems like a lot, there actually aren't a lot of versions of this map that this chart that exists anymore. So it is quite the feat that the State Archives is able to to keep and preserve 3 copies of it.
So it's probably worth mentioning that the story that Hall, it was the one who threw things over the side of the boat, comes from his assistant and successor and colleagues. Hall had a reputation for having a short temper. He had a reputation for keeping a shotgun by his desk. He had all sorts of reputations, most of them not good. So it's the fact that we get it from the people who knew him and his assistants lends weight to the idea that he committed sabotage and became the last chart standing at the end. So this is a remarkable find. And it's one of the sort of jewels of our collection, just because it is just a large and gorgeous piece of work, but it does have a fascinating history. So Tom, back over to you.
Well, again, I'm blown away. So the government does a lot of things. The state government operates prisons, it paves roads, it maintains all kinds of infrastructure. And but the documents that government produces give us windows into poetry. As the documents that government produces give us great windows into beautiful artwork, really in the service of marking the state's boundaries. It gives us wonderful stories about the entertainment industry. The P.T. Barnum story is, wow, how else are you going to learn about that? It gives us great doorways into art created just for the sake of creating beautiful works, the Verplank Colvin material. And it gives us great stories like James K. Hall and his efforts to be the last chart standing. That was really well said. Just a couple of questions for you all. If someone wants to come in and see these resources, is it possible? How do they do that?
Certainly. We have all of our finding aids and quite a number of indexes are available online. We ask that you, if you do want to see something from us, that you do make an appointment. It's generally best to make an appointment a day or so ahead of time. But we are open Monday through Friday, 9:30 to 4 o'clock. You are welcome to come in. If you want to see something like the James Hall chart, give us a little extra time because this sucker's big. But anything else we can certainly bring out and make available. If you go again online and look at our finding aids, they list things that are restricted, generally things that are exceedingly fragile or things that fall under the case of privacy law, like state penitentiary records. There may be some restrictions on those, in which case we'll need to look over them before you view them. But you are more than welcome to come in and view everything that we have in our collection.
And if you want to make an appointment, you can email Josh or I or any of our colleagues. We take turns monitoring the research email at archref, ARCHREF @nysed.gov, nysed.gov. And we will be happy to help you book an appointment, figure out what you want to look at, and then if you happen to find things that you want copies of, we will continue the conversation and get you those copies that you need.
The only other thing to add is bring a jacket because it's very cold in here.
Yes.
Well, why is it so cold?
Down in his office.
Yeah.
Why is it cold?
We keep it cold to preserve the records, Tom. So back behind us is the stacks where it's a balmy 50 degrees and 30% humidity. It may be a whole 10 degrees warmer in here. We've been here for a couple of hours sitting up, and boy, you can tell.
Well, thank you for doing your Shackleton imitation. We appreciate it. Hey, Josie, are there some questions in the queue?
Well, we don't have any questions in the queue yet, but I'm hoping that people will recognize this as their opportunity to ask their burning questions. And I just want to say how cool some of those things were and how unexpected sometimes the finds are in an archives that preserves government records. So I'm always thrilled to see the different kinds of things that, you think government records, you think there's just such a narrow definition for that, but any activity that the government is involved in can produce and kind of create all these other kinds of records that you don't even think of. So I would just like to commend to everyone the idea of always talking to your reference archivist, because they will know what the interesting things are that you haven't even thought of that might be in those records. So we do have a couple of questions coming in. So the first one is, I have old Württemberg army documents that my ancestors brought from Germany in the 1830s when they came to Niagara County. Are these something the archives would want?
We are the state archives, so in general, we do not collect things. Well, we do not collect things, period. We draw from the state government, and they generally are quite happy to chuck their documents at us. So people you're probably looking for are the New York State Library, our colleagues and friends here who share a research room with us. They do take donations. You might also try the New York State Museum, of course, though it sounds like the documents are more sort of the library's bailiwick. So definitely contact them. They know the procedure much better than we do.
And there are some great repositories in Western New York where that document might be particularly illuminating for folks. The Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society or the Buffalo History Museum would also be great potential places for your ancestors' documents to find a place. But I think Josh's initial response were the state archives. So we're really limited to collecting just the records that are produced by New York's colonial and state governments. So so we have the military service records of individuals who were in the New York State militia or served in the New York State Volunteers during the Civil War, because that was a government function and a government activity, and that's why those records wind up in the archives.
But I think it's a great idea for people when they have these kinds of records in their homes and in their attics or wherever they may be, to find a place for those records where they can be properly preserved, because all of those can be potentially valuable to future historians and just regular old people in the future. So I think that's a great idea to look for a home for those documents.
And we don't be hesitant about calling the state archives and talking to a reference archivist, because we could probably refer you to a repository that might be appropriate. Because we do have a statewide program where we support those non-government repositories across the state. So we have a network of folks that we can tell you about and hopefully help you find the best home to care for your historical records.
So we have a really important question. What happened to Foster after his chart was tossed overboard?
Oh,
I can't say I know for certain. A lot of the stories and recountings that I saw about this particular chart all end with the fact that Hall was successful in his endeavors. Foster kind of fades into the background, but it would be interesting to find out. It's definitely another research rabbit hole for us to go down and see if we can figure out what happened.
Unfortunately for Foster, Hall was connected to sort of scientific community, including like Louis Agassiz, one of probably America's most famous scientists at the time. Foster and he was working with Ebenezer Emmons, could not keep up with that kind of star power. So it kind of sounds like he was chased out of town. Unfortunately, just too much of the wrong sort of publicity. He was a school teacher, and he didn't have the sort of clout that Hall had. So.
Okay, well, I think that has answered all of the burning questions, but I just want to say thank you so much for sharing these finds with us today. I hope everybody out there found it engaging and interesting. And I would like to thank all of you who joined us for joining us today. And if you're interested in learning more about what we do, please visit archives.nysed.gov. That's the New York State Archives website. And also our website for the Archives Partnership Trust is nysarchivestrust.org. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and would like to see some more of it, you can email us at aptrust@nysed.gov. And if you do that, you can receive a free past issue of New York Archives. You can even receive the one that that was mentioned with Jasmine Bumper's piece called Dolly Diplomacy. That was a great issue. And I would also like to invite you all to join us for our next online speaker series, which is November 28th at 12:30. And that one is titled The Freedom Seekers Experience Through New York State. And I would also like to invite you to join us for our featured event of the year, which is the New York State Archives and History Awards. That's going to be taking place on November 8th at 7 p.m. And we'll be honoring Pulitzer Prize winning biographer John Meacham. You can find more information about that event, or you can register to attend it virtually at our website, nysarchivestrust.org.
I'm just going to add, Josie, before you go into your next little piece, someone asked, will this recording be available online? This and all of our previous speaker series are available on our YouTube channel. It'll probably be out there in a couple of weeks. Sorry.
We'll be signing autographs later. So thanks so much, Jamie and Josh and Tom. Thank you so much for this presentation today. And thanks to all of you out there. And I hope to see you at the next online speaker series. Take care.
Bye.